Good morning, and I hope everyone is doing great today. My name is Gary Gann, and I am a procurement counselor at Tribal Government Institute Apex Accelerator, and we're located in Norman, Oklahoma. Today's webinar is a continuation of our discussion regarding DoD Cybersecurity Model Certification, otherwise known as CMMC. And we have a special guest with us today, Mr. Adam Austin from Totem Technologies. Mr. Austin is the cybersecurity lead at Totem Tech, which is a small veteran-owned prime USAF contractor, and he is going to share some information regarding CMMC compliance from a cost and durations perspective. Mr. Austin will also introduce several resources that Apex Accelerator clients can use along their cybersecurity compliance journey. Feel free to place your questions in the questions panel, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Mr. Austin, we are happy to have you with us today, and we are excited to get started.
All right, can you hear me okay, Gary?
I can.
All right, thank you very much to the TGI Apex Accelerator again for having me. I'm going to be sharing my screen here, so let me share my screen. For the opportunity to present part 2 of our 2-part series on CMMC compliance. I'm going to be talking about expected cost and duration today from our perspective as a small business DoD prime contractor. We're a micro business, in fact, 15 employees, growing slowly. We've been executing an Air Force logistics contract as the prime since 2015. The cybersecurity requirements were first incorporated into a contract in 2016. So we've been at it since 2016. Our contracts are 5-year IDIQs, so we've been very fortunate to execute that first IDIQ and then be awarded the follow-on as well. So we've been doing this for 8 years now, and I'll relate some of our experiences from our perspective and how long it's taken us. We're still not done yet, or we're still not to the point where we would pass a CMMC assessment. We've been working at it hard, and it hasn't been cheap. So this presentation is not necessarily going to be all sunshine and roses. I'm going to give you some hard facts and some truths here. There are some silver linings to all this, which we'll touch on at the end of the presentation, and I'll stick around as long as you all have questions after. I would just suggest you save the questions till the end. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. When I first started doing presentations like this and webinars and live speaking events, I was given some advice to always start a presentation with a story. So I typically start CMMC presentations with the story that our government tends to tell, which I think is also pretty self-evident, that the Chinese and other adversaries are stealing our collective intellectual property, compromising our military competitive advantage. And when you see pictures like this side by side of our F-35 on the bottom there and the J-31 on the top, the Chinese knockoff copycat version, it's pretty obvious. And the government asserts, and I agree, that it's every person, every company's duty, responsibility to help secure that intellectual property from these adversaries. But lately, the story's gotten a little stale for me. I've recently heard politicians use China as the boogeyman, not only militarily, but also for events as disparate as the train derailment in Ohio in the spring, the social unrest in the summer of 2020, and even the lights going off at the Super Bowl in 2013. And for us as a small business, we're not part of the F-35 supply chain, nor any other high visibility weapon system like F-35 or Hummers or anything like that. We do weather sensing systems for the Air Force. So it's a little less relevant for me. So today I'm going to tell a different story, and the story is called "How Can I Ensure My Business, My Small Business, Can Continue Doing Business as a Department of Defense Supplier and how much is it going to cost me? And it's a kind of choose your own adventure story where there are three main characters: federal contract information, let me turn my pointer on here, or FCI, controlled unclassified information, CUI, and the cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC. You might have heard of CMMC. So the story goes like this. If your small business, if your organization cannot currently affirm, most of the time these affirmations are coming in the form of questionnaires that our customers are asking us to fill out, where we have to affirm that we've implemented some basic cybersecurity protections that are called out in a FAR clause. That's a Federal Acquisition Regulation 52-204-21. So if we can't currently affirm that, and in the near future, when CMMC is a real thing, and we'll talk about the CMMC timeline in just a bit, if we can't affirm that we conform to CMMC level 1 requirements, then we cannot receive from the government or from our customers or be caused to generate any kind of federal contract information. That includes subcontracts, task orders, delivery orders, emails, any communications period related to a federal government, no matter where you are in the supply chain. So whether you're a prime contractor or second tier subcontractor or third, fourth, fifth, sixth tier supplier or vendor, you can't handle any of this information. There's one exclusion to this information, this types of information, that's called simple transactional information. Essentially, your invoices back to your customer are not covered by these requirements. So, but everything else related to a federal government contract is all other information. The gist here is that if we don't have some basic protections in place, like having antivirus installed on our workstations, like having alarms and cameras and locks on doors and windows on our brick and mortar facilities, we don't have some basic protections like that in place, we can't adequately protect this federal contract information because it's not supposed to get into the hands of the general public, let alone our adversaries. So there's some basic stuff that we have to do to protect all information related to a contract, no matter where you are in the supply chain. There's a more sensitive subset of FCI called Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI. And currently, if we can't affirm that we abide by a DFARS, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement for the DoD, DFARS 252-204-7012 clause, which mandates that we implement a cybersecurity standard that's published by NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. That standard is the 800-171 standard, which requires us to develop some sophisticated plans for the protection of CUI, plans like a system security plan, a plan of action and milestones, kind of a get well plan for your cybersecurity program, incident response planning, so being able to identify cybersecurity incidents and report those to the DoD. If we can't do all that currently, and in the near future, if we can't pass what's called a CMMC level 2 certification assessment, then we won't be able to handle, so receive, store, process, transmit controlled unclassified information, which is, for most of us in the DoD supply chain, is information of a more technical nature, information like drawings, specifications for tolerances and conformance reports for tangible parts or widgets that go into DoD weapons systems, for instance. So like machine shops that take raw materials like aluminum and machine them into valves that go into motors or engines in the F-35. Information related to those types of parts, but also information related to systems, to buildings that the DoD owns, information of a technical nature. Any kind of export controlled information on a government contract is considered CUI, ITAR especially, with the sole exemption of COTS, so commercial off the shelf. If you are selling, if you have a contract to provide the government with commercial off the shelf products or services, then you're exempt from all this. But the rest of us are not exempt. We have to protect with some additional more stringent cybersecurity protections, this controlled unclassified information. So that is the story as it is now and as we're facing in the near future. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the CMMC model. I'll talk about what it costs to implement compliant cybersecurity program now and in the future when CMMC is a thing. And if we talked about the basic protections for FCI, there's sort of a spectrum of protections where you have like really in the weeds technical types of protections on your workstations like antivirus, and then you also have physical protections of your buildings. And there's a spectrum of a dozen or so basic protections in there. When we talk about protecting controlled unclassified information, that spectrum widens a whole bunch, and there are, in order of magnitude, more protections that we're expected to put in place. Awareness and training programs, cybersecurity risk assessments, network and component scanning capabilities, so you're looking for adversarial activity in your IT system. There's a lot more stuff to do to protect the more sensitive subset of federal contract information. And we have to have plans to manage all that. So it's a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, most of our peer small businesses in what's called the defense industrial base, the DIB, have no idea where to start with all this, have no idea how to interpret the language, the requirements that are coming from the Department of Defense and from NIST. They really have no idea even how to start with the very first step, which is to identify the types of information that are being handled and that must be protected. There's something called SPRS scoring. We have a separate workshop on supplier performance risk scoring system, but they have no idea if they handle CUI that they're subject to these requirements to do a self-assessment, which results in a score that you actually have to report to the DoD. If you handle CUI, you most likely have to do that, and many of us don't even know that we have to do that. We certainly, because we're busy running our business, we have no idea what strategies and tactics there are for implementing all these cybersecurity protections. Have no idea that we must be able to identify cyber incidents. Like, we can't just rely on the FBI to tell us that we've been hacked. We have to be actively searching for attacks and threats. And when we discover an active attack, we have to be able to report it to the DoD so they can come help us. All of these things, we have typically no idea. And then even when we start to wrap our heads around this, we think, oh, I'll just pay a company to come help me, or I'll buy the piece of technology that solves all my problems. I'll buy a little box and put it in our server rack, and that's the cybersecurity software that I need to protect. It doesn't exist. 50% of this problem is a people problem, where we have to establish a culture in our organization to implement all these requirements. We really can't outsource building a culture and ensuring that our people are operating, our staff are operating securely in our environment. On and on and on. There's a lot that we don't know what we don't know when we're first starting our cybersecurity compliance journey. So we're Totem Tech and the Apex Accelerators and other of our contemporaries. We're all about educating the small businesses and then providing resources so that you all can stay working down that path towards compliance. It's admittedly a long journey from start to finish. I liken it to like a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. Most of us could do that hike. It's just going to take us a long time. It's not like we're trying to climb Mount Everest. Most of this stuff is achievable for a small business. In fact, it's all achievable for a small business. We're a testament to that. But it takes a long time, and it can cost a lot of money. So that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to skip over, in the interest of time, any deep dive on us. Suffice it to say, we were an Apex Accelerator client. They helped us win our first client. They were called PTAX back then. We're based out of Utah. We do logistics for the Air Force. We formed Totem Tech in 2017 to help educate our peers and offer some consulting services and some software that will help us along our journey. So we can get a better understanding of the types of information that we're required to protect, we have this sort of Russian nesting doll Venn diagram here. It's lots of layers, but ultimately the the relationship between these types of information is relatively simple. The government just tries to make it a little too complicated. We talked about FCI. That's all information related to federal government contract, except for simple transactional information like invoices. Requirements for protecting that are called out in a FAR clause. So all federal government contracts will see this clause in it, and the primes are required to flow this clause down to their subcontractors. When CMMC comes along, FCI will be protected at CMMC level 1. There is a more sensitive subset of FCI that we call Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI. For most of us, it's information of a more technical nature. So federal contract information with a technical bent. The Department of Defense likes to make things complicated. They call CUI that's handled on a DoD contract covered defense information. So CDI is just CUI that we encounter when we work as part of the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. So I'm just going to use the term CUI going forward because just to keep it as simple as possible. There are 6 or so typical types of CUI that we would encounter as a member of the Defense Industrial Base. They're laid out here. They have fancy acronyms. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, is in charge of defining categories of CUI and providing examples of CUI. So CTI, controlled technical information, are things like engineering drawings, specifications, conformance reports, technical manuals, software source and executable code. DCRIT, critical infrastructure information, is information related to DoD facilities and bases itself, including information related to infrastructure provisions on a DoD base like internet service, water filtration, electricity generation and transmission. There are 2 categories of nuclear related information, one specifically for naval nuclear propulsion, and the other one just a sort of general catch-all for unclassified nuclear technology information. As I mentioned, all ITAR encountered on a DoD contract is considered controlled unclassified information subject to these protections. And then some of us might handle what's called OPSEC, which is information related to DoD missions. So for instance, at our company, I mentioned we're logistics, so we have to ship things all over the world. The locations of forward operating bases for the DoD are considered OPSEC information. So some of our shipping locations, the addresses themselves are considered CUI. And it matters, the sort of granular categorization of this information matters because we need to wrap our heads around what types of information we're handling and where in our IT system we're doing that, because some of these have additional impact levels that would reduce the options for us to use certain cloud services, for instance. All right. Certain flavors of Microsoft 365 we can't use if we're handling ITAR information. So it matters to do this categorization, but ultimately it's all controlled unclassified information, which is ultimately all a subset of FCI. The CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, will be, when it is in effect, which it is not yet, it will be the DoD's method of holding us accountable for properly protecting these various types of information. So it's important to understand what types of information we're talking about so that we can understand the CMMC. CMMC is it's a stratified compliance model, all right? 3 layers or 3 levels. Level 1 is for all DoD contractors. No matter where we are in the supply chain, we all handle some sort of contract information. So level 1 is for federal contract information. There are 15 basic cybersecurity requirements. Remember, I talked about antivirus on one end of a spectrum, securing our physical facilities on the other end of the spectrum. And the DoD estimates that its industrial base is about 221,000 companies strong. I think that number is probably higher, but that's DoD's estimate, and 140,000 of us would only need to meet CMMC level 1 because we only handle the federal contract information. And at this level, we'd be required only to do an annual self-assessment and provide some affirmation back to the DoD that we have all these requirements met. It's yet to be determined what that method of reporting to the DoD will be for level 1. Those of us that handle the CUI, the more sensitive subset of FCI, the technical, mostly technical information, will not only need to meet level 1, we'll need to meet level 2. And at this level, DoD estimates about 80,000 of its supply chain members handle CUI. And we now have an order of magnitude increase in the number and stringency of cybersecurity protections that we have to put in place. We call these protections best practices, requirements, controls. Those are all synonymous terms. So if you hear me use the word control, which I'll use a lot, that just means a cybersecurity best practice that we have to put in place. So because this information is more sensitive, we have more best practices that we must put in place. The spectrum of requirements gets a little broader. 110 controls are published in that NIST standard. And at this level, not only will we have to do an annual affirmation or an annual self-assessment and report the results of that self-assessment to the DoD. And by the way, this annual self-assessment protocol has already been established by the DoD. That's the SPRS system, Supplier Performance Risk System. So if we handle CUI, we see the DFARS 7012 clause in our contract. We'll see some associated clauses that require us to already be doing annual self-assessments. But the difference between the current protocol and what we'll face when CMMC is a real thing, and I'll show you the timeline for CMMC in just a minute. In CMMC level 2, we'll actually have to hire a third-party independent assessment organization called a C3PAO, a CMMC third-party assessment organization. We'll have to hire one of these entities to perform a verification assessment at least once every 3 years. So we'll have to have an independent objective verification of our implementation of all of these protections. And that's not going to be free, all right? So it'll be similar to those of us that operate quality management systems and have quality management requirements in our contract, like achieving an ISO 9001 cert or an AS 9100 cert in the aerospace industry. It'll be very similar to that type of, you go hire a third-party assessment company to perform the verification. The difference between those quality types of certifications and CMMC will be that the CMMC will be much more intense than that, much more burdensome, much more costly. All right, we'll talk about costs in just a minute. A very small percentage of us, only 1,000 or 1,500 of members of the Defense Industrial Base, all your large prime contractors, and then some others of us that work on critical weapon systems like hypersonic missiles, the missile defense systems, the nuclear arsenal upgrade that we're undergoing. That subset of the DIB handles what I just sort of call CUI plus, so more sensitive, more impactful CUI, still unclassified, but pretty sensitive. When you talk about hypersonic missile development, the new arms race, you can imagine that's pretty sensitive information. These companies will be targeting CMMC level 3. So not only will have to do all this stuff, level 1, level 2, they'll also have level 3. They'll have some additional requirements that are called out in a separate NIST document, the 172 document. We're not quite sure how many additional requirements. Best guess right now is a couple of dozen additional requirements for a total of somewhere north of 130. Additional requirements such as an annual penetration test. So hiring a company annually to come and simulate an attack against your company and see if you can recognize it and respond to it. So even more stuff to do at this level. And at this level, the government through an entity called the DIBCAC, which is the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, will perform what's called a Delta assessment. So the government will actually do verification above and beyond level 2. So they'll do the level 3 verification of the additional controls in the 172 standard. So that's this model. That's what we're facing. Right now, it appears like at level 2 and level 3, it will be a sort of binary. You either have done everything you need to do and can participate in the DIB, or no, your system is not adequate and you can no longer work in the capacity that you were contracted to work in the DIB until you rectify that. You either have a certification or you don't. That's what we're facing. So we have to be near perfect with our implementation of 800.171 in order to achieve level 2. That's what's coming. This is not, CMMC is not a thing yet. I want to stress that, and it won't be for some time. So I want to take a look at the timeline for CMMC, okay, and then I'll circle back and we start talking about some costs. We are currently here on this timeline that's at the bottom of the slide. The DoD is still in what's called rulemaking, the rulemaking process for CMMC. The proposed rule by the DoD is now being reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget. When it's finished with its review, which will be sometime this month, it will publish the proposed description, the proposed structure, the proposed paradigm of CMMC. It'll publish that in the Federal Register. There'll be a period of public comment where we, as the taxpayers, get to make comments and suggestions on the CMMC model. The minimum period of public comment is 60 days, 2 months. But what's expected is that the period of public comment will actually be much longer, and that the DoD will actually have to answer all of our questions and respond to all of our comments as we submit them through the Federal Register. And that period of public comment will last much longer period, over a year perhaps. At that point, when the public comment period is closed and all the comments have been adjudicated, then and only then can the DoD start putting the CMMC requirements in contracts. So industry suspects or predicts that it won't be until Q1 2025 before we start seeing CMMC requirements in contracts. In the meantime, NIST is constantly working to update their standards, so we'll actually see changes in the standards. There's a line in the sand that the DoD has drawn October 2025 for all new contracts to include the CMMC requirement. I think this is a little unrealistic. I think once the DoD has the ability to put the clause in contracts, it'll have to phase it in and introduce the requirement in contracts in a phased approach over time. So I think many of us won't see the CMMC requirement for quite a while, for a year, year and a half, maybe 2-3 years. However, I need to stress that that's not a suggestion to stick your head in the sand or drag your feet on this. We can attest it takes a long time to do all this stuff that's required of us, especially as a small business with limited resources. So let's talk about some of the numbers, what it takes to implement the cybersecurity requirements at these various levels. So with level 1, CMMC level 1, this is the basic protections for federal contract information. Remember, there are 15 basic protections. They run the gamut from in the weeds stuff like antivirus on your workstations to physically protecting your buildings. There are 15 practices. When we do the self-assessment at this level, there are 61 or so things that we have to assess ourselves on. So we implement the practice or the control, and then it's a little bit more granular how we verify that the implementation is effective, what we call assessment objectives. There's 61 of those. We also have some policies to develop that, so some of these controls, even at level 1, aren't necessarily technical. We need to, for instance, maintain lists and policies of authorized users and devices in our environment. We have to establish a visitor escort policy for our brick and mortar facilities. We have to establish a policy that prevents our staff from posting FCI publicly on social media or on the web page. And we have to list all of the interconnections between our systems and other systems. Like if we use cloud-based services like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, we have to identify all of those types of connections and put some basic security provisions in, like requiring usernames and passwords to use all these systems. So there's a lot of writing that actually has to be done. And our maximum, or the typical time for developing all those policies is not hours, it's a couple days to a week. So that's resources that your company has to expend to develop policies, just writing stuff down. And then in terms of implementation, like actually getting all the practices in place and working in your environment so that you can pass these assessment objectives, the minimum implementation time that we see for even level 1 is a couple of months. All right, it does not happen overnight. And there's no magic box that you can just install in your network and be good. It doesn't exist. In terms of the actual documentation, you're looking at dozens of pages of documentation. And this is always the million-dollar question. How much does this cost? In both internal labor and external service provision to meet level 1 controls, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars annually. Even a one-person organization can expect to spend 5 figures, maybe $10,000 annually to maintain a compliant cybersecurity program, even at CMMC level 1, just for the protection of FCI. Now, when we talk about CMMC level 2, the protection of controlled unclassified information, those numbers increase by an order of magnitude, by a factor of 10 in most cases. The number of practices jumps from 15 to 110. We already talked about that. When we do the self-assessment, or when we hire the CMMC assessors, when CMMC is a thing, there are actually 320 assessment objectives. For us to assess ourselves, or when we have a client that hires us to perform an assessment, that assessment to get through all those 320 assessment objectives takes us several business days. So that's lost staff time, or you have to pay somebody to help you with that. In terms of developing the policies, you're now talking about it takes a couple months to get all of the policies in place, all of the documentation developed, and there are hundreds of pages of documentation. At our little company, we literally have hundreds of pages, like a couple hundred, maybe 300 pages of documentation describing our system security plan, because we have to be able to communicate, to describe what we're doing eventually to a third party. So we have to have all our T's crossed, our I's dotted. Implementation time is really one of the stark contrasts here. We need to do things like put endpoint protection in place, so monitoring our workstations for adversarial attack. We need to manage all of our mobile devices, so if you allow your staff to view their email on their personal phones, you actually have to manage their personal phones as an organization. You have to take some administrative control, and it can take a while to wean staff into that sort of cybersecurity culture. It takes time to set up all the technologies. You have to log all staff and authorized personnel. You have to log all of their access into your facility. For most of us, that means installing like RFID badge readers at our brick and mortar headquarters. I'm in our headquarters in Utah here. I can't get into this facility without badging in, and a little log is generated every time I badge in, and it's stored on a server here. We also have to be hunting for vulnerabilities, flaws, and adversarial activity in our environment, and that takes some technologies that most of us don't have to start our journey. And so all this stuff adds up, and the implementation of all the technology and all the new policies and procedures takes time, and for most of us, it's going to take well over a year to implement the 110 controls in the NIST standard. I already talked about documentation. Again, the million-dollar question, how much does this cost me? At our company, our what we call care and feeding costs to maintain a cybersecurity program is approaching 6 figures. All right, we are just about at $100,000 in licensing fees for the technologies, lost time due to our internal labor maintaining the program, and paying managed security service providers to help us with the monitoring of our environment. It's about $100,000 a year. And I told you we're not quite finished yet with all of our implementations, so we're still doing some of this as well. And we do that on a project by project basis, which costs time and money as well. I'll talk about some costs again here in a bit. So back to this timeline chart, this blue bar here represents the average minimum time it takes for a company to comply with CMMC level 2. So if you plan on handling, or you currently handle CUI, and you haven't started yet the implementation of the standard, the cybersecurity practices, this is about how long it's going to take you. So if you're of that procrastination mindset and you're going to work backwards from when you can expect to be held accountable for doing this, then you can't drag your feet longer than about mid part of next year. However, I am not advocating at all that you do that. We have been on our journey since 2016, and we are still not 100%. We're pretty close. We're pretty close to having all those 110 controls in place, but we're not quite there yet. We've been waiting on Microsoft to put some new services out that we can take advantage of, and we're slowly incorporating those services as Microsoft publishes them, because we use Microsoft 365 as an example. So I would not drag your feet. In fact, if you have the DFARS 7012 clause in your contract and you're dragging your feet, you are technically in violation of statute and can be held accountable in court before CMMC is a thing. I'm going to skip this page here for time purposes. So this chart is going to show us our clients' average starting place. So I mentioned that cybersecurity compliance is a journey. This chart is going to give us some depiction of where our clients start that journey from and what it means for them in terms of costs, monetary costs to complete or continue down the path towards compliance, continue on that journey. So we have completed for ourselves and for our clients 52 assessments of the NIST 800-171 standard implementation for the protection of controlled unclassified information. These assessments would be akin to what we would hire a CMMC third-party assessment organization to do for us when CMMC is a real thing. Again, CMMC is not a real thing yet. You cannot get CMMC certified yet. The scoring system starts, or the perfect score is 110. 110 out of 110. So the assessment right now results in this score. You can go very negative in the scoring system. It's a rubric in which you subtract points for deficiencies, for inadequate protections. And you can actually go as low as minus 200 something. So we've completed 52 fully assessments for our clients, and this is a histogram of their scores at the moment that we completed the assessment. These are great scores up here and pretty negative, poor scores down here. Right now, there's no punitive repercussions for having a low score. The DoD just wants to know what your score is so it can do a similar accounting of where all of its ducks are, so to speak, where its industrial base members sit. In terms of what we can look forward to a score translating to CMMC, there's something called the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessments that are happening right now. You can actually volunteer to be like a pathfinder or pilot program for CMMC type of assessments. And the DoD has been hinting that a score of 88 or better would pass a CMMC level 2 assessment. And last year, the DoD did a survey of the industrial base and said that a score of 70 or greater was good enough at that time in the summer of last year. We actually consider above 0 halfway decent. It's a challenge just to get to like 0 in your scoring system. At a 0, you still have some significant protections in place. You obviously have some work to be done to get up to a passing or a perfect score, but we consider it decent. It usually means that our client or ourselves have been at this they've been on their journey for a while, years now. they probably have 1 or 2 major projects, implementation projects, or maybe some paperwork left, like the paperwork's not quite complete. Very few of us have done this alone. Most of us will outsource some of these capabilities to managed service providers. Many of us will use IT shops to help do day-to-day IT, like manage our endpoints, onboard new users, manage our antivirus. And the vast majority of us will outsource the ongoing continuous monitoring, the hunting for adversarial behavior in our networks. We'll outsource that activity to a managed security service provider. That's the case for our company, for sure. But as I mentioned, just to do that maintenance, just to do the ongoing, what we call care and feeding of a cybersecurity program, is for most of us pushing 6 figures annually. And part of that is the anticipated cost of CMMC assessments. Recall that at level 2, you'll have to have an independent assessment at least once every 3 years. The companies, there are some companies exist that are gearing up to be able to do these assessments, the C3PAO companies, and they have started to publish their rates. The minimum rate that we have seen published is $32,000 for the smallest of a small business for one of these assessments. And for larger organizations, it'll be looking like a 6-figure investment for an assessment every 3 years. Not the implementation, the assessment. So if you amortize, and at our company, we're anticipating an assessment fee of somewhere around $50,000 because we're a prime contractor. So if I amortize those costs every 3 years, I have to factor that into this figure. All right. You're looking at we're looking at 6 figures for sure annually. So you have to have a sufficient revenue stream doing the work that you do in the industrial base just to maintain the cybersecurity compliance. Now, for companies that are below 0, between 0 and 100, they still have some re-architecture to do of their IT system, most likely. They're not even yet into the care and feeding costs. You're looking at probably several projects to complete left and tens of thousands of dollars to do that. And you're still looking at most of our clients a year plus to getting into passing range if you're between 0 and 100. And then south of minus 100 is usually those clients that have just started doing business, or the executive leadership there isn't quite convinced that CMMC is going to be a real thing, and they're just sort of going at it piecemeal. They're going at it alone. They don't have any managed service support. They're not using companies like Totem to consult for them to help them out, and they're facing a 2+ year journey and 6 figures of just re-architecture. Most of these clients in this route. So I told you I was going to be full of sunshine in this workshop, right? Real talk is that this is not cheap. You have to have sufficient revenue stream to in the high 6 figures to be able to approach handling CUI, and in the high 5 figures to be just participating in the industrial base and handling federal contract information. And you're looking at, most of us are looking at a year plus of journey towards compliance, towards being able to pass one of these assessments that are coming. So that's the real talk. There is good news with all this. First of all, the more that you can shrink the footprint of your IT system that handles this information, whether it be FCI or CUI, the less that you have to pay. So we have an approach that stresses the upfront task of what we call scoping our system, really spending a lot of time upfront determining how we can shrink the footprint of our IT system that we're going to use to support the DoD contract, and shrink the number of our staff that need to come in contact with this information, shrink the license cost for technologies, all of that. The more that we can do upfront by identifying what information we handle, characterizing its life cycle, and distilling our IT system down to the smallest possible footprint as possible, can help save us some money in the long term. So we stress, don't go start looking for technologies that are going to solve your problems. And I told you there's no magic bullet. There's no single technology that you can buy anyway. But before you start thinking about technologies, period, or outsourcing any kind of service provision, gather your stakeholders within your business and shrink the footprint of your IT system, shrink the footprint of the information. Those of us that allow all of our staff to be administrators and have unfettered access to all of our network, and that's on the digital side. On the physical side, we print out every piece of federal government information, every email, and retain all that paper in boxes like in a mezzanine or something like that. If we can shrink the footprint on from both of those fronts, you will save money. Even in the second phase of our approach, we're still not talking about buying technologies yet or outsourcing anything. We're focusing on documenting what we currently have in place, our current IT system, document what the expected future state of that thing will look like once we shrink the footprint. And then we can move into building plans that will lay out an effective approach towards compliance. The system security plan, which is like a set of blueprints for your expected cybersecurity program. Incident response capability, that's a separate plan. POAM, which is like a set of work instructions for how you turn the SSP into a reality. And then at that point, we can do a self-assessment and generate the score. And it's only then that we start talking about buying technologies or outsourcing to service providers and doing the implementation. Totem Technologies is a consultant. We help and teach our clients through workshops how to do all of this stuff. And we also do consultations that coach our clients on how to effectively implement the specific things that they're going to implement in their specific environment. So there is help out there for all this. Totem is an example of a consulting company that provides this help. We're not the only one. Your Apex accelerators can introduce you to us and other consulting organizations out there. Apex accelerators are themselves, the counselors are being coached to support, certainly with CMMC level 1 and the protection of FCI, and then draw on other resources for other coaching and support. So there's a lot of support out there. We have a ton of free resources on our website. So just a little bit of self-promotion here. We have a roadmap to compliance. So if you go on our website and look at this, it breaks down the milestones, kind of that phased approach like I was just talking about. And then a bunch of free tools to help you implement plans and policies and procedures. And I mentioned our workshop. We also offer a what we call Zcast, Zero Client as a Service, which is a secure cloud-based enclave for all of your CUI if you don't want to mess with it in your on-prem IT system, and it can save some costs. So there are resources out there for defense industrial base members. There's also good news on the cost offset front. The DoD has started to understand that the cost of doing business with it in terms of cybersecurity compliance is seriously burdensome for small businesses, and starting the legwork to put together grant programs that we can apply for through, for example, manufacturing extension partnerships to get access to some money to help offset the cost of this. Because right now, all of these costs are, while they are allowable, like we can include them in our overhead costs, we're not getting reimbursed for these at all. This is just the cost of doing business with the DoD right now. So a little bit of silver lining. I promised a silver lining at the end. There are a lot of resources out to help, but ultimately your company has to walk the walk. Your company has to take the journey, that compliance journey. So we can help. Apex Accelerator counselors can help. That's why we very much value these opportunities to present. Just want to express my appreciation to the Tribal Government Institute for facilitating these two presentations. That's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to stick around as long as there are questions or topics that any of you all want to discuss. So thanks, Gary. I'll turn it back over to you all.
And thank you, Mr. Austin, for delivering an excellent and informative presentation today on this important topic. And we
Informative,
appreciate,
if not rosy.
yeah, I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah.
But, we appreciate you sharing your experience with your cybersecurity journey. We do have a couple of questions from our audience, so let's get
Okay.
started. And if anybody else can think of any other thing that you want to ask, go ahead and place those questions into the questions panel. So the first question is, since CMMC will only be required for the Department of Defense contracts, do you think other non-DoD federal government agencies will adopt something similar?
Yeah, that is a great question. And up until about 2 weeks ago, it would have been an emphatic yes. Starting with the Department of Homeland Security, and then I would suspect Department of Energy after that. Up until a couple weeks ago, there had been talk about, DoD is the tip of the spear with a lot of initiatives in the federal government. They do the pilot, the pathfinding, and Homeland Security was hot on its heels for adopting something similar to CMMC. But a couple of weeks ago, Homeland Security published at least for the foreseeable future, they will only require a self-assessment. In other words, they're not going to spin up or not adopt for a while at least the DoD's CMMC paradigm. So that really has shaken my belief that the CMMC would be adopted across the executive branch. So now I'm not so sure. At a minimum, if you handle CUI, there will be an overarching FAR clause pretty soon. The Congress is in the process of putting together this requirement that mandates the adoption of the 800-171 standard if you handle CUI, and that will be a FAR clause and not just a DFARS clause. But what will be lacking with that clause is some method of accountability, like the self-assessment. Apparently, there's a huge swath of the defense industrial base that either just doesn't do the self-assessment or falsely reports the results. So the DoD has identified that as a source of risk. Like, it's not a true method of holding us accountable. That's the whole reason behind the CMMC. So it won't be for years, several years, that any other executive branch agency adopts something like CMMC. It's just for DoD right now. Doesn't
Okay.
mean you don't have requirements to protect the information, though. I want to stress that.
Okay. How will small businesses communicate progress and updates throughout the assessment and certification process? Is that accomplished solely through SPUR scoring?
It is, yeah. So if I go back to this, if we go look at, yeah, so it's through the SPURS, which is Supplier Performance Risk System, and you will have it's solely through that, or you can also submit some information to an email address that's managed by the Navy, but most of us are going to get access to this SPRS database. And you will know if you have to do that because you will have separate clauses in your contract or flow down to you through subcontract. Those are clauses 7019 and 7020. I'll type those in the chat here. So it's DFARS clause 252.204-7019 and 7020. So 7019 is included in all solicitations. So pre-contract award, you will have to have an SPRS score. And 7020 is included in all contracts, and that requires us to maintain a fresh score, no older than 3 years in SPRS. That is the method of reporting right now. Informally, our customers, so your customers, like a prime contractor, might put out a memo or a questionnaire or an appeal for reps and certs to its supply chain. In fact, we're a subcontractor as well, in addition to a prime, and I just got an email yesterday from one of our customers asking us to attest to where we are in our 800-171 implementation, where we are in our supply chain risk management. So informally, you could be asked by your customers to respond to requests for information like that. Let me push enter on this chat. All right, so it's in the chat. DFARS 7019 and 7020 are the formal requirements for self-assessment reporting.
Okay, perfect. Okay, if I am only a subcontractor on DoD contracts, does my organization still need to be CMMC certified?
When CMMC is a thing, yes, the entire industrial base, whether you're a prime, a sub, a supplier, vendor, wherever you are, you fit into this 221,000 company estimate. You will, at a minimum, be required to self-assess at level 1. And the key here is, where does the information go? So if you are handling CUI of any type, information of a technical nature related to a DoD program, those requirements will come to you. They'll be flowed down to you. And so you will not just target level 1, you'll be targeting at least level 2.
Okay. If a weakness is found during my organization's assessment, what is the time window to correct them so we can pass the assessment?
That's a great question, and that has not yet been published by the DoD. We expect when the CMMC rule is published sometime this month that those protocols will all be laid out in the rule. You know, what's a passing score? What does it mean when you don't pass and you have just a few deficient controls? Like, will you have some period of time within which to remediate those deficiencies and be retested? We expect that there will be some allowance like that, but we don't know yet because the rule hasn't been published.
Okay. Do you have or do you know of any starter templates for creating a system security plan?
Yes, if you so there's a template available from NIST. I'll pop out of here and go into my browser here for a second. There's a template available from NIST. So if you Google NIST 800-171 Rev 2, and I'll put a link to this in the chat for you. So this is Rev 2. There is an SSP template right here that you can download. I'm still sharing my screen, Gary. Is that, you see that?
Yep.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
This is not sufficient in my opinion, though. So I'm going to put a link to this in the chat. And it's blank. There's nothing in there. It's just like, hey, here are the controls, and then text fields for you to describe how you meet the controls. So this is kind of like a false promise in my opinion. If you attend our workshop, this online workshop, it's a 9-week workshop. At the end of this, you will be DFARS compliant. We offer you not only an SSP template, but boilerplate starter policies to help you start your journey on a run instead of at a walk. And you get access to that in the workshop as part of participating in this workshop. It's not a free workshop. You have to pay for it. There are grant programs to help offset the cost of the workshop, but there are companies like us that are offering our experience in crafting an SSP to our peers through engagements like this. But if you want to see like what the very rudimentary SSP might look like, you can download this Word document from NIST. NIST is not doing you any favors, though, by telling you how you should approach it as a small business.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Well, Mr. Austin, I'm not seeing any additional questions, but I want to thank you and Totem Tech for joining us today. This is a very important topic, and I hope that everyone that wants to do business with DoD takes this seriously and gets started on this cybersecurity journey as soon as possible. And for those of you on the call, be sure to reach out to us if you can think of any additional questions. And have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye.